Never confuse quiet with harmless. That mistake costs people everything. Sweet on the surface, steel underneath. My dear chosen ones, listen closely. This isn't a warning for you. It's a realization for them. The ones who mistook your calm for weakness. The ones who thought silence meant surrender. The ones who looked at your patience and assumed you didn't have teeth. They're finding out now, slowly, uncomfortably, publicly. What they're realizing is this. The sweetness they laughed at wasn't who you were. It was what you allowed them to see. They thought they were standing on solid ground because you didn't push back. They thought the water was shallow because it looked still. What they never understood is that depth doesn't announce itself. Power doesn't shout. And intelligence doesn't rush to prove anything. You didn't stay quiet because you had nothing to say. You stayed quiet because you were listening, watching, measuring. And while they were busy getting comfortable, you were getting clear. Some of you are wondering right now, why does it feel like they're suddenly uneasy around me? Or, why are people acting different now that I've changed nothing? Here's the truth. Chosen ones, you didn't change. The mask fell. Not yours, theirs. Your presence has always carried weight. You just stopped cushioning it for their comfort. And now the room feels different because the power dynamic shifted without you ever raising your voice. They told themselves stories about you, that you were too nice, that you were easygoing, that you'd always be there, always forgiving, always understanding. Those stories made them bold, careless, reckless. People always reveal their true nature when they think they're safe from consequences, and you gave them that illusion. Not because you were naive, but because you were smart enough to let them expose themselves fully. Let's clear something up for anyone doubting themselves. Was your kindness fake? No, it was controlled. Was your silence weakness? No, it was restraint. Did you let things slide? Yes, strategically. Because chosen ones understand something most people never do. Reacting too early ruins leverage. You didn't rush to defend yourself because you weren't on trial. You were gathering evidence, every joke that crossed the line, every boundary they ignored, every moment they underestimated you, logged, remembered, stored. Now here's the part that hits them hardest. You didn't play small because you lacked confidence. You played small because you didn't need to dominate the room to own it. You knew that the loudest person is usually the least secure. You knew that the most dangerous player is the one nobody's watching. So you smiled, you listened, you let them believe they were winning. And that belief became their blindfold. Chosen ones, this is why it feels like people are scrambling now, why the tone has shifted, why the energy feels tense. They're realizing the version of you they took for granted was never the full picture. They're replaying moments in their head, asking themselves questions they should have asked earlier. Did they really not notice? Was that silence intentional? What else did they see that I missed? That's fear. Not of your anger, but of your clarity. Because once someone sees clearly, the game ends. No more guessing, no more excuses, no more emotional discounts. And you've reached that point. You're not angry, you're precise, you're not loud, you're decisive. And the scariest part for them, you don't need revenge, you don't need to explain, you don't need to prove anything. Your absence, your detachment, your calm withdrawal does more damage than any confrontation ever could. So let them realize, let it hit them slowly, let the weight of their misjudgment settle in. You were never just sweet, you were selective, you were never passive, you were patient. And now the patience phase is over, not with noise, not with drama, with resolve. Chosen ones, this is your reminder. Being underestimated was never your loss. It was your advantage. And now that advantage is activated. And before we go any further, pause with me for a second. Because if this is landing the way it's supposed to, it's not random that you're here. If you've ever felt people shifting around you, acting different, getting quiet or defensive as they start realizing your sweet side was never the full story, then stay right here. This channel isn't for spectators. It's for the ones who are waking up to their leverage. If this message resonates, let it be known. Tap like, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and drop a comment below with "I see it now" if you know people are finally catching on. Your engagement keeps this space sharp, focused, and unapologetic. And now, let's break this down step by step, because if you're truly one of the chosen ones, you're about to recognize these exact signs unfolding in your life right now. Most people never experience this shift. They wouldn't survive it, but you're built for it. Let's get started. Number 1. Your niceness was never real. It was a strategic cover. You wore politeness like a mask, not a name tag. The most dangerous move you ever made was letting them believe you were harmless. My dear chosen ones, let's get something straight right now. Your kindness was never your identity. It was a tactic, and the fact that they're only beginning to realize that now, that's not an accident. That's timing. They thought the smile defined you. They thought the calm tone meant compliance. They thought because you didn't bite back, you didn't have teeth, and that miscalculation is about to cost them. You didn't show up gentle because you were weak. You showed up gentle because you understood human behavior better than they ever did. You knew exactly how people operate when they think they're in control. You knew they'd relax. You knew they'd talk too much. You knew they'd reveal patterns, insecurities, and intentions the moment they believed you were safe, quiet, and manageable. So you let them believe it. That wasn't softness. That was intelligence. Some of you might be asking yourself right now, why did I let so much slide? Or why didn't I correct them earlier? Here's the answer, chosen ones. Because correcting someone too early warns them. You weren't there to educate them. You were there to observe them. You weren't bonding. You were collecting information, every overstep, every lie, every time they underestimated you and showed their real face because they thought you wouldn't remember. You did remember. You always do. Your kindness wasn't about pleasing people. It was about keeping the environment calm while you watched everything, like a storm cloud that doesn't thunder until the pressure is right. They saw politeness. They missed precision. They heard softness. They didn't feel the restraint behind it. You weren't passive. You were patient. And patience, when paired with awareness, becomes leverage. They assumed kindness meant permission. That because you didn't push back, they could push forward. That because you smiled, you agreed. That was their fatal misunderstanding. You didn't show them who you were capable of being. You showed them what they could handle. You limited your presence on purpose. You capped your energy. You held back, not because you lacked power, but because you knew exactly how disruptive it would be if you didn't. Chosen ones, this is why the shift feels so sharp now. They're losing access to the version of you that made them comfortable. And comfort is addictive to people who benefit from your restraint. The panic you're sensing isn't random. It's the realization hitting them that the kindness they took for granted was never submission. It was strategy. And strategies end. They're replaying moments now. Your silence, your calm responses, the way you didn't react when they expected you to. They're starting to see it wasn't confusion, it was control. You were 10 steps ahead, and they were busy celebrating step 2. Now they want to backtrack, apologize, reframe, rewrite history. But the problem is, chosen ones, you don't forget patterns. And once the pattern is clear, the mask comes off. You held back the storm so they wouldn't drown. That was the mercy phase. But storms don't disappear. They arrive when the pressure is right. And now all they can do is remember how safe they felt when you were playing small. You were never the nice one. You were the quiet force giving them time to adjust. They didn't take it. They stayed comfortable. and now they're about to learn exactly who they were dealing with all along. Chosen ones, being underestimated was never your flaw. It was your advantage, and this is only the beginning. Number 2. You didn't become agreeable. You learned how to disappear on purpose. You learned to blend in so you wouldn't be taken out. Camouflage isn't cowardice. It's what intelligence wears when the environment is hostile. My dear chosen ones, let's dismantle another lie they believed about you. You didn't become sweet because life treated you kindly. You became sweet because life taught you early that standing out too boldly attracts unnecessary danger. You learned the rules before most people even realized there was a game being played. You saw how honesty could be punished, how directness could be used against you, how strength, when revealed too soon, made you a target. So you adapted, not emotionally, strategically. What you mastered wasn't people-pleasing. It was emotional camouflage. You learned how to lower your volume without losing your edge. You learned how to soften your presence without shrinking your awareness. You didn't disappear. You blended. You became just palatable enough to move freely, just agreeable enough to stay underestimated. And that wasn't weakness. That was survival intelligence. Chosen ones carry a certain weight. Even without saying a word, your presence changes the temperature of a room. People feel it. They just don't always understand it. Some get curious. Others get uncomfortable. Some feel threatened without knowing why. You noticed that early. You saw how simply being yourself created tension, envy, or resistance. So you made a calculated choice. You gave them a version of you that felt easier to digest. Not because you needed their acceptance, but because you understood human reactions well enough to predict the outcome. They weren't interacting with the real you. They were interacting with the version of you that kept things calm while you observed. And while they were relaxing, you were analyzing. You were reading patterns, tracking inconsistencies, and quietly measuring intentions. Every friendly exchange had layers. Every soft response had purpose. You weren't there to connect blindly. You were there to assess, to calculate, to understand who you were really dealing with. Some of you might be thinking, why do I always feel like I'm watching instead of participating? Or, why do I notice things others miss? That's not detachment. That's awareness sharpened by experience. You learned to scan environments the way others scroll their phones. You noticed tone shifts, power plays, microaggressions disguised as humor. You didn't react. You recorded. They thought you were gullible. They thought you were passive. They thought they were running circles around you. What they didn't realize is that the person they believed they were manipulating was dissecting their behavior like a professional. They were playing checkers. You already understood the board. You saw the rules before they finished explaining the game. What they labeled naive, you labeled reconnaissance. And now that you're dropping the camouflage, the discomfort is setting in. Because they're realizing the softness was never about trust. It was about caution. You didn't become kind because you believed everyone meant well. You became kind because you knew exactly how people behave when they think they're safe to be themselves. And they showed you everything. Chosen ones, this is why the shift feels intense now. The act is over. The environment has changed. You no longer need to blend in to stay protected. And the energy that's surfacing, it's unfamiliar to them because they never had access to it. They thought they had influence over you. They thought they understood you. They were wrong. You didn't lose your sweetness. You outgrew the need to use it as armor. And now they're facing the version of you that was always there, just no longer hidden. Number 3. They called it weakness because they couldn't detect control. You bit your tongue on purpose, not because you were afraid. Restraint isn't the absence of power, it's the proof that power exists. My dear chosen ones, this is where they got it completely wrong. They looked at your restraint and labeled it weakness. They saw you pause instead of react and decided you were scared. They watched you stay quiet and assumed you had nothing sharp to say. What they never understood is that silence can be heavier than noise, and control is far more dangerous than chaos. You weren't holding back because you couldn't respond. You were holding back because you knew exactly what would happen if you did. You understood consequences before they ever did. You understood that once certain words are spoken, once certain lines are crossed, there's no rewind button. You weren't afraid of conflict. You were aware of impact. And awareness is something people who live impulsively don't recognize until it's too late. Some of you are thinking right now, why didn't I just shut them down earlier? Or why did I keep letting it go? Here's the answer, chosen ones. Because you weren't giving them permission. You were giving them rope. Every time you stayed calm while they poked, tested and pushed, you were watching how far they'd go once they thought there were no consequences. And they showed you every time. Your silence was never empty. It was loaded. It was a pause before a verdict. Every moment you didn't respond wasn't confusion. It was a decision. You knew exactly what to say, how to say it, and how deeply it would land. That's why you didn't rush. You were measuring. Timing matters when you actually have power. People who lack it explode early. People who have it wait. They mistook your patience for passivity. They assumed because you didn't lash out, you couldn't. Because you didn't retaliate, you wouldn't. That's the trap they fell into. They don't understand your kind of strength because your kind doesn't perform. It doesn't posture. It doesn't announce itself. It holds the line, stays composed, and watches people defeat themselves. That's what unsettled them on a level they couldn't explain. Not your words, your restraint, because only someone who's been through real pressure learns how to stay calm under it. Only someone who knows what they're capable of doesn't feel the need to prove it. You didn't need to intimidate them. Your presence did that quietly. Chosen ones, here's the truth they're starting to face now. You weren't quiet because you were scared. You were quiet because you were protecting them from the version of you that doesn't negotiate, doesn't soften the truth, and doesn't stop once it starts. Your boundaries weren't fear. They were warnings. Your patience wasn't a trait. It was a countdown. And now that countdown is ending. The version of you that absorbed disrespect, smoothed things over, and tried to keep everyone comfortable is fading. Not out of anger, out of clarity. What's coming next doesn't argue. It doesn't explain. It doesn't play by rules designed to benefit people who take advantage of restraint. They're finally realizing you never lacked power. You just refused to waste it on people who didn't deserve the fallout. Number 4. You were never soft. You were delaying impact. You pressed pause on your power on purpose. The calm you saw wasn't peace. It was a countdown. My dear chosen ones, understand this clearly. Your sweetness was never meant to last forever. It was never a permanent version of you. It was a strategic delay. A conscious decision to slow the moment, stretch the timeline, and let things unfold far enough for the truth to expose itself without you lifting a finger. You weren't trying to be liked. You were buying time. And that difference is everything. Every soft laugh, every calm response, every moment where you chose restraint over reaction was intentional, not accidental, not passive. You knew exactly how much force you carried. You knew what would happen if you released it too early. You understood that power, when revealed before its moment, doesn't dominate. It gets resisted. So instead of crashing through the room, you lowered the volume and watched who got comfortable in the quiet. Some of you may be wondering, why didn't I shut it down sooner? Because chosen ones don't rush impact. You knew that the unfiltered version of you would have ended conversations, relationships, access immediately, and you weren't done observing yet. You dressed intensity in politeness. You wrapped authority in warmth, not to deceive for deception's sake, but to let people relax long enough to show who they really are when they think nothing's at stake. Comfort makes people careless. When people think the sun is permanent, they stop preparing for weather. And that's exactly what happened. They mistook your calm for comfort. They assumed your patience meant you'd always stay in that lane. They thought the sweet version was the final version. They didn't realize it was a placeholder, a temporary interface, a holding pattern while you gathered clarity. Chosen ones, you weren't being fake. You were disciplined. There's a difference. Anyone can explode. Anyone can react. It takes real strength to remain composed when every instinct in you knows the situation deserves force. You didn't hold back because you were unsure of yourself. You held back because you were sure of yourself. You knew that unleashing everything too soon would waste the moment. You didn't become powerful later. You didn't suddenly grow a backbone. You've had it this entire time. You just chose not to use it on people who hadn't yet earned the consequence. That's the part they're struggling to understand now, because suddenly the warmth is gone, the softness has lifted, and they're left standing in front of a version of you they never prepared for. They're panicking because they're realizing what your sweetness was hiding. It wasn't innocence, it wasn't endless patience, it wasn't peace, it was pressure, fire held in control, energy under discipline. And now that the delay is over, they're seeing the scale of what you chose not to be, until now. They thought the storm wasn't coming because the skies stayed clear for so long. They assumed the warmth meant safety. They never understood that warmth can be a warning, and warnings don't repeat themselves forever. At some point they expire. Chosen ones, you didn't change. That's the truth. You didn't become colder. You didn't become harsher. You simply stopped postponing the inevitable. The pause served its purpose. The observation phase is complete. And now, the version of you that no longer stalls, no longer cushions, no longer delays, is stepping forward. And for those who mistook your patience for permanence, this is the moment they realize how wrong they were. Number 5. You used calm as a weapon. While everyone else made noise, you used calm as a silencer while you took control of the game. Silence isn't weakness, it's what you use when you want to hear everything. My dear chosen ones, understand this clearly. You weren't calm because you were outmatched. You were calm because you had too many options on the table. You could have spoken up. You could have exposed them. You could have ended things publicly, loudly, decisively. And that's exactly why you didn't. Because power doesn't rush to prove itself. Power chooses timing. They thought your grace meant you didn't have leverage. They thought your politeness meant you were cornered. They confused your restraint with limitation, not realizing restraint is what people use when they're already winning. You weren't being gracious because they deserved it. You were being gracious because it bought you something far more valuable than a reaction: silence. And silence is where the truth gets loud. When you stay calm, the noise drops. And when the noise drops, everything becomes visible. Every inconsistency, every lie that doesn't quite line up, every insecure jab disguised as humor, every move they made while assuming you were too nice, too distracted, or too passive to notice. You noticed. You just didn't interrupt the performance. You let them talk. You let them overstep. You let them believe the stage was theirs. Chosen ones, this is where people get it wrong. You weren't trying to keep the peace. You were creating stillness. And stillness is dangerous for people who rely on chaos to hide their intentions. While they were busy performing confidence, authority, or superiority, you were mapping behavior. You weren't reacting because reactions give away position. You were positioning. They thought your silence meant you had no response. What they didn't understand is that silence can be a test, and they failed it repeatedly. Every time they pushed a boundary and you didn't explode, they pushed further. Every time you didn't call them out, they revealed more. They mistook your patience for permission. That mistake always costs people. You weren't submitting. You were setting the board. You weren't scared to confront them. You were deciding how far they needed to go before the truth became undeniable, even to themselves. Because once someone walks far enough into their own behavior, there's no exit that doesn't involve accountability. And you let them walk, step by step, comfortably. That calm they relied on. It was never for their benefit. It was for your control. If you had reacted too early, you would have shown your hand. You would have warned them. You would have given them the chance to adjust, deny, or rebrand. But by staying composed, you let them build momentum in the wrong direction. They didn't realize they were stacking evidence against themselves. Now they feel it. The shift, the tension, the absence of that familiar softness. And what unsettles them the most is that they can't point to the exact moment they crossed the line. That's because calm doesn't announce consequences. It delays them. And delayed consequences hit harder because they're earned. Chosen ones, notice how you still haven't raised your voice. You still haven't made a scene. And yet things around them are unraveling. That's not coincidence. That's cause and effect. When people abuse access, comfort turns into exposure. When they take silence for granted, silence becomes judgment. Your calm didn't forget. It recorded. And now the game has changed, not because you exploded, but because you stopped protecting them from the outcome of their own behavior. That's what real control looks like. Number 6, you let them underestimate you because it made them careless. You let them underestimate you, and that's how you took control. Never interrupt someone while they're busy underestimating you. My dear chosen ones, this part hits differently because it was never accidental. You saw it the moment they met you. The quick scan, the assumptions, the way they shrank you down in their mind to something simple, harmless, manageable. They decided who you were before you ever spoke. And instead of correcting them, you let them. That wasn't hesitation. That was mastery. You didn't rush to explain yourself. You didn't defend your intelligence, your depth, your awareness. You didn't argue when they misread your silence or mistake your calm for cluelessness. You understood something they didn't. The fastest way to expose someone is to let them believe they're smarter than you. So you gave them space. You let them talk. You let them assume. You let them write a version of you that fit their comfort level. While they were busy turning you into a harmless character in their head, you were paying attention. Not emotionally, strategically. You noticed how they spoke when they thought they had the upper hand. You watched how their tone changed when they believed you weren't a threat. You clocked their insecurities, the jokes that weren't jokes, the subtle power plays, the ego leaks. You weren't offended. You were informed. Chosen ones, some of you wonder why you didn't shut things down earlier, why you didn't correct the disrespect the moment it appeared. Here's the truth. Correcting someone early teaches them how to hide better. Letting them believe the lie lets them reveal everything. You knew the bigger the false image they built of you, the more careless they'd become. And careless people always expose their weak points. So you played along. You nodded when they underestimated you. You smiled when they tried to belittle you with harmless comments. You let them think they were in control. And that illusion gave you access. Access to patterns. Access to behavior. Access to the blueprint of who they really were when they thought no one was watching. Your sweetness wasn't just a mask. It was a spotlight. It brought out entitlement. It amplified arrogance. It exposed who respects boundaries and who exploits them. People reveal their character fastest when they think they're superior. And you gave them that stage, not to please them, but to study them. Now the shift has happened, the illusion cracked, and they're scrambling because the version of you they built in their mind doesn't match the one standing in front of them now. The calm feels different. The silence feels heavier. The smile doesn't land the same, because they're realizing something too late. They never actually knew you. They thought controlling the narrative meant controlling you. But chosen ones, you were never in their story. You were observing it. You were writing your own the entire time, and now that you've stopped pretending, they're facing a version of you they never prepared for, the one that sees clearly and no longer needs to play along. That's where the panic comes from, not from confrontation, from miscalculation. They don't know how to respond because the rules they were playing by don't apply anymore. The sweet version was a setup. The real version is decisive, grounded, unavailable for manipulation. Chosen ones, letting them misread you, wasn't passive. It was positional. You didn't lose power, you gained leverage. And now that leverage is activated, checkmate wasn't loud, it was inevitable. Number 7, you played gentle to see who would exploit it. You played nice to see who would turn nasty. Kindness doesn't just comfort people, it exposes what they do when no one's stopping them. My dear chosen ones, understand this clearly. You didn't build a gentle persona because that was the limit of your strength. You built it because gentleness is the cleanest test there is. Power makes people behave. Fear makes people perform. But kindness? Kindness gives people room. And when people have room, they reveal who they really are. That's why you showed up open, calm, and grounded. Not to be liked, not to be protected, but to observe. You weren't handing out sweetness because you had nothing else to offer. You were setting conditions. You wanted to see who could be trusted with access, who would treat generosity with respect, who would honor boundaries without needing enforcement. You weren't asking questions out loud. You were asking them through your presence, and the answers came fast. Some people handled your gentleness with care. Others treated it like an invitation to take more than they deserved. That's the difference you were watching for. Some of you might be thinking, why did I keep giving chances? Or why didn't I cut them off sooner? Because chosen ones don't rush conclusions. You let patterns form. You let behavior repeat. You let people get comfortable enough to stop pretending. You weren't naive. You were thorough. Every ignored boundary, every subtle manipulation, every moment they acted entitled to your time, energy, or forgiveness was another data point. You weren't hurt. You were informed. Your kindness was never meant to reflect them back to you as approval. It was meant to reveal them under pressure-free conditions. That's why it worked. They couldn't blame stress. They couldn't claim misunderstanding. They couldn't hide behind conflict. You gave them clarity, and they still chose exploitation. That's why the exposure is so uncomfortable now, because they weren't forced into it. They volunteered. Chosen ones, here's the part they didn't anticipate. While they were busy performing politeness, you were measuring character. While they were saying the right things, you were watching what they did when there were no consequences attached. And now the results are in. Some people failed that test completely, not because you judged them, but because they judged themselves with their actions. They mistook your gentleness for naivety. They thought softness meant endless access, that because you didn't immediately shut things down, you never would. That assumption is collapsing right now. And the fear you're sensing isn't about being confronted. It's about being seen. Because it's hard to pretend you're decent when your behavior is being compared to someone who never stopped being genuine. You didn't trap them with manipulation. You trapped them with freedom. You let them choose. And they chose poorly. That's why the energy has shifted. That's why the mask is slipping. It's not just that you see through them now. It's that they know you always did. That smile you wore, It wasn't approval, it was patience. Now the pretending is over. You're done diluting yourself to make others comfortable, and they're done hiding behind excuses that only worked when you stayed quiet. What's left is the truth. Clean, exposed, undeniable. Not everyone benefits from honesty. Not everyone survives clarity. But chosen ones don't exist to protect illusions. You exist to end them. Number 8. They thought you were passive. They were completely wrong. They mistook your calm for compliance. They never saw the edge beneath it. Peaceful doesn't mean powerless, it means disciplined. My dear chosen ones, this is one of the most dangerous mistakes they ever made about you. They saw your calm and assumed you were harmless. They noticed your patience and decided you were easy to step over. They watched how you avoided chaos and concluded you couldn't handle conflict. In their minds, you were gentle by nature, soft by default, someone who would always choose quiet over confrontation. And because of that assumption, they thought they could silence you, steer you, pressure you, and get away with it. What they never understood is this. You didn't choose calm because you were incapable of force. You chose it because you were capable of control. You weren't peaceful because you were weak. You were peaceful because you knew exactly how far things could go if you didn't restrain yourself. You understood that not every situation deserves your full intensity. You understood that reacting too fast gives people power they haven't earned. So you held back, you watched, you gave space. Not because you didn't see what was happening, but because you were waiting to see how far they'd take it once they thought you wouldn't push back. And they took it too far. Some of you might be asking right now, why do they look shocked when I finally draw the line? Or why do they act like I've changed? You haven't changed, chosen ones. You revealed a layer they never bothered to consider. They thought your calm demeanor meant you didn't have boundaries. They thought forgiveness meant unlimited access. They thought avoiding conflict meant avoiding strength. That's where they misread you completely. You never chose peace at the cost of self-respect. You chose peace as long as it didn't require self-betrayal. And the moment that line was crossed, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. The calm didn't disappear. It sharpened. What once felt gentle now feels firm. What once felt open now feels closed. And that shift is terrifying to people who benefited from your restraint. They expected you to keep absorbing pressure just to keep things smooth. They expected you to excuse behavior that never should have been repeated. They expected you to stay in the role they assigned you, the agreeable one, the understanding one, the one who doesn't make things a big deal. But chosen ones don't exist to make other people comfortable at their own expense. And the moment you stopped doing that, the illusion shattered. Here's what really unsettled them. You didn't explode. You didn't beg. You didn't explain yourself endlessly. You simply became precise, calm but immovable, clear but unprovoked. You didn't raise your voice. You raised the standard. And suddenly the same people who thought you were easy to control are scrambling, because control doesn't work on someone who knows where they stand. They never thought you were capable of drawing a hard line. They never imagined you'd choose yourself without apology. They thought your patience was infinite. They thought your calm meant you'd never confront them with consequences. And now they're realizing they were wrong. Very wrong. Chosen ones understand this deeply. Discipline is far more intimidating than aggression. A person who can stay calm while enforcing boundaries is not someone to underestimate. You don't need to prove you're a fighter. Your clarity does that for you. You don't need to threaten. Your consistency speaks louder. And when you finally stop giving people space to disrespect you, they feel it immediately. They mistook your restraint for fear. They confused your composure with submission. They thought you were built to endure anything. Now they're learning you were built to decide when enough is enough. And once that decision is made, there's no negotiation. They didn't expect this version of you, but this version has always been there. You were calm by choice, and now you're firm by choice. That's the part they never prepared for. Number 9. Your kind side was the warning phase before the shift. The smile was the line. Cross it, and everything changes. The calm you enjoyed was never permanent. It was the pause before the decision. My dear chosen ones, this is the moment most people never see coming. Your sweet side was never the full story. It was the last barrier, a shield, a controlled layer between who you allowed yourself to be and who you become when patience runs out. They didn't understand that. They thought your kindness was your personality, your limit, your ceiling. They believed you would always stay right there, soft-spoken, understanding, endlessly forgiving, willing to clean up messes that weren't yours. And that belief made them careless. That smile they used to feel safe around, it doesn't land the same anymore. They can feel it. Something about it is sharper now, distant, unreadable. Not because you're angry, but because you've decided. And chosen ones, once a decision is made, the energy shifts whether you announce it or not. You didn't need to explain. You didn't need to confront. The atmosphere did the talking for you. Some of you may be wondering, why does it feel like people are suddenly uneasy around me? Or why are they acting different when I haven't said anything? Here's why. They're sensing the switch, the point of no return. The version of you that tolerated confusion, excuses, and emotional messes is quietly stepping aside. And what's stepping forward doesn't negotiate with manipulation anymore. Your sweetness was never weakness. It was a threshold, a grace period, a space where people had room to correct themselves, to take responsibility, to show self-awareness. You gave chances, not because you didn't see the issues, but because you wanted to see who would rise to the moment. And some didn't. They kept crossing lines, kept resetting the same patterns, kept assuming your silence meant you'd always stay. That's when the barrier started to crack. Notice this. You didn't explode. You didn't lash out. You didn't dramatize the shift. You simply withdrew your emotional access. And that's what unsettled them, because now your smile isn't covering tolerance anymore. It's covering clarity. It's covering boundaries. It's covering a final decision they weren't included in. And that's the part they can't control. Chosen ones, this is what real power looks like. Not rage, not revenge, not speeches, detachment, precision, calm exits. They don't fear your anger because anger can be manipulated. They fear your clarity because clarity doesn't bend. Once that switch flips, guilt stops working, apologies lose their magic, promises sound hollow. You don't argue anymore because you already understand. Every act of kindness you showed was a test. Every moment you stayed was a countdown, not a threat, a timeline. You weren't being passive. You were being generous with time, attention, and access. But generosity without accountability always expires. And when it does, it doesn't announce itself loudly. It simply ends. Now, the version of you that's arriving doesn't ask follow-up questions. It doesn't explain why. It doesn't reopen closed doors just to be polite. It walks away cleanly. It cleans house internally. And it doesn't look back, not because it's cold, but because it's done. Chosen ones, if this resonates, it's because you're standing at that exact line right now. The smile was the warning. The patience was the grace period. And the shift you feel, that's not anger. That's alignment. And once alignment takes over, the game they were playing no longer exists. Number 10. You chose self-control in a game designed to corrupt you. You paid with restraint in a rigged game, and now the bill is due. They mistook your self-control for tolerance, not realizing it was the cost of keeping your power intact. My dear chosen ones, your softness was never given because they deserved it. It was given because you refused to let anyone drag you down into a version of yourself you'd have to spend years undoing. That's the part they never understood. You weren't being gentle to be liked. You were being deliberate to stay clean. While they were poking, provoking, baiting you for a reaction, you stayed composed. Not because you didn't feel it, but because you knew exactly what they were trying to steal. They wanted your reaction, your anger, your breakdown, your slip. Because once you lost control, they could justify everything they were doing to you. They could say, "See, they're no different." But you didn't give them that satisfaction. You chose restraint as a form of protection, not for them, for yourself. Because you understood something critical early on. The real prize in any ruthless game isn't winning the argument. It's walking away without losing who you are. Some of you might be asking, why did I keep taking the high road? Or, why did I keep choosing calm when I had every reason not to? Here's why, chosen ones, because you saw the trap. You saw that the game was designed to corrupt you, not challenge you. They weren't trying to understand you. They were trying to contaminate you, to provoke you into pettiness, to pull you into chaos, to get you to abandon your standards just so they could feel justified in theirs. So you chose softness strategically. You chose patience. You chose silence. Not because you were weak, but because you were disciplined. You knew that reacting in the moment would feel good, but cost you later. You were playing long-term preservation, not short-term satisfaction. Every time you walked away instead of clapping back, every time you chose composure over revenge, you were protecting your future self from regret. And while you were doing that internal work, they were getting messier, louder, sloppier, more entitled. They thought your restraint meant immunity for them. They thought because you didn't respond, there would be no consequences. That was their mistake, because consequences don't always arrive as confrontation. Sometimes they arrive as withdrawal, distance, access revoked. Chosen ones, the shift you're feeling now is real. The rules have changed because the phase has changed. You're not being the bigger person anymore because that role has expired. Not out of bitterness, out of completion. You gave what you needed to give. You showed who you are under pressure. You passed your own test. And once that happens, there's no reason to keep paying with your energy. They're confused now. They don't understand why the warmth they depended on is gone. Why the version of you that absorbed their behavior without complaint has disappeared. But that version wasn't permanent. It was provisional. It existed to get you through a chapter, not to trap you in it. You didn't stop being sweet because you hardened. You stopped because the transaction ended. You learned the lesson. You kept your integrity intact. And what they're dealing with now isn't punishment. It's the natural outcome of exhausting someone who refused to lose themselves just to keep the peace. Chosen ones, understand this. Self-control isn't free. You paid for it with silence, patience, and restraint. And now that payment has matured, the softness that once protected your character is no longer required. What's left is clarity, boundaries, and a calm distance that speaks louder than any reaction ever could. Number 11. You didn't change. You stopped performing for others. They thought you were built to glow, not to strike back. They mistook your calm for compliance, not realizing it was discipline holding power in check. My dear chosen ones, this is where their misunderstanding becomes undeniable. They looked at your composure and assumed you were fragile. They saw your ability to stay centered, to stay civil, to move with empathy, and decided you were built to bend. They were wrong. What they never grasped is that calm doesn't come from weakness, it comes from control. And control is always closer to force than chaos ever will be. They assumed that because you didn't explode, you couldn't. Because you didn't retaliate, you wouldn't. Because you didn't escalate, you weren't capable of ending the conversation entirely. That was the illusion they lived in. They believed peace meant passivity. They believed empathy meant you lacked judgment. They believed forgiveness meant forgetfulness. And that belief made them careless. Chosen ones, you were never floating through life untouched by reality. You've seen enough. You've absorbed enough. You've learned exactly how destructive people become when they think there are no consequences. You didn't ignore that truth. You mastered yourself in the presence of it. You learned when to stay quiet, when to observe, and when to let people talk themselves into exposure. That wasn't softness, that was training. They wanted you agreeable, easy to digest, predictable. They wanted you to fit into their comfort zone so they wouldn't have to look at themselves too closely. But you were never meant to be convenient. Your presence was always disruptive, not because you caused chaos, but because you refused to participate in it. You didn't play along with lies. You didn't validate manipulation. You didn't reward bad behavior with reactions. And that alone unsettled them more than any argument ever could. Some of you may be wondering, why do people get defensive around me when I haven't said anything? Or, why does my silence make others uncomfortable? Here's why, chosen ones. Because restraint highlights imbalance. Your control exposes their lack of it. Your steadiness reflects their instability. And when people are confronted with that contrast, they don't feel inspired, they feel threatened. Your presence was never passive. It was pressure, quiet pressure, the kind that forces truth to surface without you saying a word. They sensed it in the way you looked at them, in the way you didn't rush to explain yourself, in the way you didn't chase validation. There was weight there, authority without noise, and they didn't know what to do with that. Now the shift is happening. They're uncomfortable because you've stopped minimizing yourself to keep the environment calm. You've stopped shrinking to make conversations easier. You've stopped absorbing tension that never belonged to you. And the heat they feel now isn't anger. It's exposure. The room feels different because the balance has changed. The version of you that softened the edges for them is gone. Chosen ones, understand this clearly. You didn't become sharper overnight. You stopped dulling yourself. You didn't turn confrontational. You turned precise. And precision doesn't ask permission. It doesn't whisper. It doesn't perform. It corrects reality by simply standing firm. They thought your light was decorative. They didn't realize it was diagnostic. It reveals. It disrupts. It forces things into clarity. And now that you're no longer playing small for anyone's comfort, the pressure is on. Not because you're attacking, but because you're no longer shielding them from the truth. They misread you. That was their mistake. And now they're standing in the consequences of that misread. And now, as everything comes together, take a breath and really let this settle. If you've made it this far, it's because something in you recognizes the pattern. You've lived it. You've felt the shift. You've watched people slowly realize that the version of you they underestimated was never the full story. This isn't about becoming harder. It's about becoming clearer. You didn't lose your sweetness. You reclaimed your control. And that awareness changes everything. If this spoke to you, don't let it pass quietly. Hit like, subscribe so you stay connected to what's coming next, and drop 77 in the comments if you know your calm was never weakness. It was strategy. Share this with someone who's still being underestimated. Stay sharp, stay aware, and keep stepping into who you really are.